Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have independent international affairs analyst Gilbert Doctorow joining us from St. Petersburg. Also, we have researcher at Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Greg Simons, who's joining us from Uppsala, Sweden. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Gilbert Doctorow. I want to get your views on this recent drone incident.
I think this takes us into new territory. There are those of us with long memories who speak to the public about the experiences in the Cold War. And what comes to mind, first of all, is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where the two major powers came very close to war. However, where we are today is more dramatic and more dangerous than anything that has taken place since 1962. I was listening to a very serious news program, analysis program on Russian television last night, in which the senior legislator, Konstantin Kosachev, addressed this very question and pointed out that during the Cold War, there were some ground rules. There was an understanding that if you came too close to what would constitute the start of the war, you backed off. And he remarked with some great discouragement and sadness that the United States no longer recognizes that obvious fact of survival for all parties. The United States has been spoiled by 30 or 40 years of dominant position globally, or hegemony, if you want to call it, in which it has pursued with impunity and without suffering any accountability after disaster, with followed disaster, the aggressive actions it's taken in a whole series of countries, including, of course, Libya and Syria and Afghanistan. But furthermore, it's Russian interest what happened in the bombing of Serbia. The United States has paid no price for this. And the result is a mentality that the United States can continue to do whatever it likes without facing justice, without facing the court of human opinion around the globe. And that has led to taking risks that in the past no one dared to take. It's hard to say if the United States actually encouraged or helped implement this drone attack on the Kremlin. It's hard to say that the intent was an assassination of President Putin. But what is clear is that the intent of this action was to strike terror in the hearts of Russia's leadership and in large swathes of the population. They have done a good job of putting a cold shower on the May 9th parade and celebration of Russia's victory in World War II. They have put in question the safety of any public exercise on Red Square on May 9th. And because if these drones could indeed come within proximity of the Kremlin in a night attack, they could also theoretically come in proximity and in striking distance for a deathly blow against Russian leadership this coming Monday. That is, and the response of Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Peskov, the press secretary of President Putin, that brings us to very close to a Russian declaration of war on the United States. The accusation that the United States was complicit and masterminded a possibly fatal strike on the president of Russia is, under all normal conditions, a justification for declaration of war. We are that close to World War III.
Greg Simons, do you agree with our guest in St. Petersburg? Also share with us your views on this specific drone incident, and where does it fall in the broader context of the Ukraine war?
Yes, well, I mean, I am in agreement with what he says. I mean, the implications are, well, it's just, as he says, I mean, everything is uncertain now because the United States is not following rules. And if you're not following rules, then it takes away a lot of certainty and introduces a lot of risk. I mean, and if we look at the response of Ukraine, I mean, you can't really believe what they say because they're so contradictory. First of all, the spokesman for the Ukrainian president said, no, that wasn't us. How did he call it? He said it was local resistance forces. In other words, some kind of terror cell, which they have in Russia. And I mean, of course, you've got a local resistance group is not going to be acting independently of Kiev or Washington. They are going to be guided and directed by Kiev and Washington. And more specifically, you've got a contradiction because while they said it wasn't them directly, they started to draw up a stamp commemorating the attack on the Kremlin. So, yeah, Kiev's word to be taken with a pinch of salt, as is Washington. Because, I mean, if we look at their involvement in dirty wars in the past, they're constantly involved in other people's affairs, and if not directly, indirectly. I mean, they're financing this particular war, and they're also arming and doing and providing intelligence, doing all of these other things. So, I mean, the US definitely has come to a situation, as Gilbert said, you have this empire which is in terminal decline, which doesn't want to lose its hegemony. And what you have left are these messianic ideologues that are somewhat like little toddlers who have never been told no, who have never been held to account. So they are pushing the boundaries of what is expected in international relations, and especially within conflicts, to dangerous levels. And the problem is when you get these ones who have had no transparency, no accountability, then they don't know when to stop. And this is the problem. And if they don't know when to stop, someone is going to make them stop one day. And by this stage, I mean, things will be too far out of control.
Gilbert Doctorow, the United States has just approved another military aid package for Ukraine. Moscow has been accusing Washington and its allies of fueling the conflict by giving more arms to Kiev. There's always the risk of this war spilling over into other areas and morphing into something bigger, isn't it?
Very definitely. The biggest risk, I'd say right now, is Polish intervention. The Poles have been hyperactive as supporters of Ukraine. They have great ambitions to take a large part of Ukrainian territory after the Ukrainians are destroyed by the Russian armies. And they are facing a political culture in Poland that goes back 300 years of doing insane things. They are well on that track today. The Kaczynski brothers installed an extreme anti-Russian policy, which is being perpetuated by the current leadership. And there is the possibility of this conflict immediately going across the border into a NATO country. If the Poles play their hands badly, which is entirely possible, they will be acting on their own and will not be able to invoke the Article 5 NATO treaty clause, which would automatically bring in the other NATO members in their defense against Russia. It's quite possible that by sheer stupidity, the Poles will do just that. And the war, next stage of the war, will be a Russian-Polish war. However, stepping back, the underlying problem on the US side is the impunity, the feeling of being above the law and out of reach of anyone, and the mistaken notion that nuclear weapons cannot be used and therefore do not count in any strategic balance between major powers. The Russians have made it perfectly clear that a nuclear power cannot be destroyed. This is the point of the American exercise to destroy Russia, and it is a futile point that can only end in the destruction of civilization on Earth, because the Russians have said again and again they will use all weapons at their disposal, including strategic nuclear weapons, if they feel that they are being threatened with destruction.
And Greg Simons, your thoughts on the continued support that the United States and the U.S.-led NATO is continuing to give to Ukraine. Russia believes that one of the issues for the prolongation of the war could be, in fact, that the Ukrainians are constantly being supplied with this artillery, and therefore they will not accept ever to come to sit at the negotiating table.
Well, I see the main problem not with the European politicians, because they're purely stooges of the US and whatever Washington tells them to do. The problem is going to be with the public, and you've already got massive protests, anti-NATO protests, anti-Ukraine war protests in Germany and Italy, and they're starting to spread around Europe because the cost for the public is too high. There is no gain in it for the European public, and the US public is so detached. I mean, they won't even be able to find Ukraine or maybe even Europe on a map. So this is quite meaningless for them. But if we look at the politicians, of course, this leaves them vulnerable, especially when you see this instability increasing, this inflation, this energy crisis, all these different little crises coming together to form a perfect storm. And this is going to create problems for their continued support of Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, I mean, it's not an actor in this. It's an object, not a subject of this war. And as Gilbert noted, I mean, this whole thing is about containing and weakening Russia. This is nothing about Ukrainian sovereignty. And what we see now are the geostrategic imperatives which were created by Brzezinski. And this is, in particular, is in reaction to the US hegemonic decline. So what the US is going to see, and this is what Kissinger said once, the US has no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. So what we see here, what is the permanent interest? Continued US hegemony. Does it matter if you're an ally or an opponent? No, it does not. Both will, if they are seen to be too powerful, they will be reduced. And so, I mean, you can see the gradual decline, which I think of the US in terms of its global influence will continue to decline economically,
Sure.
militarily, politically. And this is what's going to end the war.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Gilbert Doctorow joining us from St. Petersburg. Greg Simons joining us from Uppsala, Sweden. That brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review. But stick around, there's plenty more to come here on Press TV. See you in a bit.